Hi, this is Terry Rich. I'm a birder and ornithologist here in Boise, Idaho. I am giving a talk every month, even through these COVID months, years, I hope not years, months for sure, at the Foothills Learning Center. And we're now, and have been for some time, doing these online here on Zoom and on my YouTube channel, which if you're watching this, you've found it. This talk is the one I always give in October, the first Wednesday in October. It's about the most common feeder birds in Idaho. There are a list of about 25 species that you can get off of Project Feeder Watch, and it's a pretty good list for us to use to structure this particular talk. The top 25 birds are a little different every year because that list comes from data from last winter, from the previous winter, and it's also the birds I'm going to show you cover all of Idaho. So we've got people watching feeders up in Moscow and Bonnards Ferry and over in Salmon and probably over in the Teton Valley, Pocatello. So you're getting a lot of birds in that northern and eastern habitats that we don't get here in the Southwest. So you're going to see maybe see a varied thrush pop up on the bottom of the list, and you're going to think, wait a minute, I never see a varied thrush around here. Well, that's right. That's because these are reports coming in from Moscow and the northern part of the state. After we look at the 25 most common birds last winter, spend a little bit of time looking at species that are similar to each other so that you have a few ideas of how to tell a Cooper's hawk from a Sharpie, how to tell a Cassin's finch from a house finch, and a few other similar species like that. And then finish with just a little bit on bird feeders and bird seed. This is really geared toward beginning birders and casual birders, or maybe just sort of getting going. But even if you're quite good at these birds and know them very well, I always like to get feedback. So if you have time to watch or to peruse, fast forward and watch, and you see something that you think I should add or something that I got wrong, I always like to hear from the experts. It's one downside of not being able to meet in person, is that you don't get that feedback from your audience. And anybody who's ever in front of a crowd, I think, has that same disappointment. There's no feedback. You rather have boos than silence. So I think I'm like a comedian, probably that way. With no feedback, you don't have so much to go with. So always appreciate feedback, and I will give you my email at the very end of the talk. So if you've got something, you can drop me a line, and I will deal with it. So let's have a look at not only the most common winter feeder birds in Idaho, but also a few places where I get this information and some other information on winter birds and winter feeding. And then we'll move into briefly toward the end into feeders and bird seed. So here's the three main areas, the top 25 feeder birds in Idaho from last winter. And I want to look at their ranking, how common they are in one year compared to another year, and look at a little bit of variation over time, because it's interesting to see that some species are always kind of in that same degree of commonness, and others vary quite a bit from year to year, and especially over a decade or so, they might vary a lot. Spend a little bit of time looking at similar species, and then, like I said, spend a little bit of time on feeders and types of seed. Since this is designed for beginners more than expert audiences, it's good to know what field guides are available out there, and there are many. I would just say here are the two I use the most. The National Geographic Guide has got over 1,000 species, so if you're just getting starting out, this can be rather overwhelming to try to find the bird you might think you're looking at. A guide we put together a couple of years ago called the Field Guide to Boise's Birds only covers 99 species. It's much more succinct, so you're not going to be looking at birds that maybe only occur in New York or northern Canada or something like that. So that's a good little book to grab. It's around $8 or $9 and can be found at the Parks and Rec, Morrison Knudsen Nature Center, and a couple other places around the valley. The go-to site, I use this a lot, even though I think I know most of the birds pretty well. I still go to All About Birds on the web a lot. And the nice thing about this site, besides being free of use, is when you go in there and type in your bird species, it'll show you whatever you asked for, of course, but then it also shows you similar species. So that gives you an immediate chance to compare the bird you think you might have seen to some others that are similar. It's a really handy way to say, okay, the bill was dark, not yellow, it had wing bars or not, that sort of thing. The first things you want to look at when you're comparing similar species. So the data that I'm going to show you today come from Project Feeder Watch, another terrific program out of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. The website that you can see looks like this. And what I'm going to do is, if you can see a little tab called Explore, right under the Project Feeder Watch title up in the corner. When you go to Explore, you can explore a bunch of different things you can see here. But what I'm interested in today is to go down to the top 25 birds. Now, if you can do all this for free. If you want to join Feeder Watch, it's $15 if you're already a lab member, $18 if you're not, and then you get access to some more information and you can participate in the program and put your data for your feeders into the program. When you go then to that Explore, that top 25, you will get this screen. If you look in the upper corner, you see top 25 feeder birds, 2019-2020. So that was last winter. And you can see I've already selected Idaho. So I'm looking at data for all over Idaho, which includes, again, those habitats that we don't have here in the Southwest. Way over on the side is the rank within the region. In this case, the region is Idaho. We'll look at some other regions later, and you will see number 1, dark-eyed junco, and so on. Over on the other side, you get some more data, the percentage of the sites that were visited. Surprisingly, somebody has a bird feeder, or a couple of people have bird feeders with no juncos. I can't imagine such a thing. I don't know where these people live, but it's not 100% there on the sites visited. And then you get data on group size and a couple other things which might be interesting. So I just want to point out that I'm going to present these in quiz mode. This works well in a live audience because you put a bird picture up and give people a few seconds to say what it is. Obviously, that doesn't work here, but I'll still wait for 1 second to put the bird name up, and then you can quiz yourself as you see these bird pictures appear. A reminder, I guess I've already said it a couple times, applies to all of Idaho. And again, this is for last winter. So here's our first number 1 bird, as you already saw, dark-eyed junco. And all these graphs are going to look the same. So you see the years from 2007, 2008. That's the starting point for this graph. And then clear over to the little red dot, which is the data from last winter. The ranking that goes down the column there on the left, as you can see, and the data from last winter on that red dot. And in this case, we'll notice that the dark-eyed junco is the number 1 most common feeder bird in Idaho over this decade plus time period. Every year, they're number 1. It's really amazing. There's no other species that's always in the same spot. And that's why it's kind of amazing to me to envision a feeder somewhere that doesn't have juncos. They are the bird. And I'll talk a little bit about variation in ranks, and this simply means that this bird has never varied from its rank. It's always the same, so there's no variation from year to year, which is pretty interesting in bird world. Very few things don't vary over time. Number 2, house finch. This bird, surprisingly, maybe, isn't number 1. It is the most common bird seen in every month of the year in southwestern Idaho. So if you were to go out in May, June, July, August, December, whatever, this is going to be the most common bird everywhere. Now, not just feeders, but people going out to Hyatt Lakes or down to the Boise River. This is the most common bird, but not on feeders. So here we are. You can see over on the very edge there for last winter, they were number 2. They're almost always number 2 behind juncos. They only dipped to the 3rd most common a couple times in the past. And so the variation that they've shown over this time period is simply 1 unit between 3 and 2. That's very stable as well. And just showing that 1 unit right there is just simply that distance between the maximum and minimum rank they've ever had. Number 3, American goldfinch. And check out number 3, that's the highest ranking they've had since 2007, 2008. Usually there, you can see at number 4. And in this graph, I've also put in a little trend line. It's a little regression line that seeks to see if there's some trend, if they're going up or down. And, you know, there's a slightest possibility that these birds have increased over this time period. I wouldn't take it to the bank, but maybe. And that's why we'll see what they do next year and the year after, see if these birds are increasing. So they varied by 4 units over that time period. Trend line right there. Next, we have a bird probably which everybody knows, the black-capped chickadee. Last winter, they were sitting at, what did I say? Where are we? Number 4. And you can see they've had quite a bit of variation over time, varying over 7 units. And that trend line, to me, looks like a legitimate increase. I think that's a real increase. We'll certainly know, again, after a few more winters go by. And I think that's good news. You can't have too many chickadees, as far as I'm concerned. Next, another very well-known bird, number 5, the American robin. And this is the first bird that really shows quite a lot of variation. It's varied by 10 units over that time period. So as common as number 3 and as rare as number 13, just in recent years. So they varied over 10 units. You can see last year they were kind of back at kind of in the ballpark or where they are more than not, around 5. And if you've ever paid any attention to robins, you've probably seen that they do. Some winters you'll have big flocks of them. They seem to be everywhere. And other winters, you can hardly find a robin anywhere. So they become very social in the winter. They group up. They're looking for fruit. And as they move around looking for fruit, they may be hanging out in your area or maybe not. So it really depends on kind of where you are, what's going on with fruit supply. That's whether you're going to have a lot of robins or not so many. Next, this is our first bird that we'll have that will really go to suet feeders, northern flicker, woodpecker. Now this is the first one. Unfortunately, looks like the population may be going a little down over time. And this ranking from last winter is kind of right on that slight downward trend. So I would be a little bit concerned about flickers, and I would want to go and look at Christmas bird count data, breeding bird survey data for Idaho, and see if they also show a downward trend or if this is a fluke. I don't think it's a fluke the way it looks, but you'd want to double check that. And then as a conservationist, start looking around, asking around, is there something going on with flickers? Something wrong with flickers, and start looking into that. Next is our first of, I think, 3 introduced species that are in this top 25 list, the house sparrow. Introduced from Europe so long ago, and as you probably know, very successful all across North America. Perhaps unfortunately, they seem to be increasing. So they've varied somewhat over time, but it certainly looks like they're on a little bit of an upward trend, and I have no idea why that might be. I haven't heard or read anything. So there's another thing to do a little bit more homework on. Next bird, certainly one of my favorites. I had 8 in my neighborhood this morning walking the dog. They seem to be coming down out of the mountains a little bit to join the residents that are living amongst us during the year, red-breasted nuthatch. Another one, unfortunately, looks like it might be declining, although you can see the variation of this bird is really quite great, 12 units. So it's gone all the way from number 4 to number 16 over the years. And I think with that kind of variation, you always are a little skeptical about trends, because they may suddenly rebound. It looks like they obviously rebounded a lot last winter for some reason, and maybe that line will flatten out after next winter. The second of our introduced species is this bird, Eurasian collared dove. And this was a real surprise when I pulled these numbers up. I did not expect to see this. So the Eurasian collared dove has varied enormously over time, not because it goes up and down, but because it's been going up at a ferocious rate. There is no other species either increasing or decreasing in North America. I'm aware of this shows this kind of a steep trend. Very, very steep increase. Probably everybody has experience with areas where there were no collared doves. In my neighborhood, I think even 6 years ago, I never saw a dove, and also now I've got them every day. So that's been their pattern, and they're way up into Alaska now, into Canada. But look at the count from last winter. It dropped back down to, what is it, number 9. So that's the first time in the feeder watch data for Idaho that collared doves have actually declined. So that's really interesting. And again, it remains to be seen if this is just a fluke. Maybe next year they're going to be back through the roof somewhere, or maybe they've plateaued, or maybe they're going down. Again, I'd want to look at Christmas bird count data, especially to see if we get a similar sort of a pattern for Idaho in particular. Second woodpecker after flicker, number 10 downy woodpecker, male with a little bit of red and the female with no red on the back of the head. These guys haven't varied too much over time. You can see only 5 units, and their ranking last winter was actually the highest ranking that they've had in the time frame I'm looking at. And again, the trend line looks like it's maybe a little bit up, so that's good news. You know, I could definitely tolerate some more downy woodpeckers. I don't get all that many where I live, and I would love to see some more along with some more chickadees. Next, we have fabulous bird, a peanut eater. You're going to feed these guys. You're going to feed the squirrels too, or figure out how to keep the squirrels away from the peanuts. Good luck. Number 11, black-billed magpie. Looks like another bird that has an increasing trend, and yet another species with the highest rank ever in this run of data last winter. So it looks like they're definitely going up. They bounce around quite a bit. 7 variation, and of 7 is quite a bit of variation. So yeah, maybe we're going to have more magpies. That's okay with me. Here's our third introduced species, European starling. This bird is a real major problem. As you probably know, they take over nest cavities. They kick out bluebirds and tree swallows, and I've seen them fighting flickers, and I've seen them fighting kestrels for their nest boxes. They're super aggressive, really bad news. That's the downside. The upside is, look at this winter plumage. I mean, once they get these wet white dots, they're really quite spectacular, and as they sit in the tops of trees, they almost look silver with all the light they're reflecting. They're also terrific mimics and do a lot of crazy vocals. So I give them a little credit for that, even though they're a real serious pest, way worse than collared doves or house sparrows. It looks like, despite a lot of variation, they are basically flat in their long-term trend, showing up a little bit lower last winter than they were for most winters, except for those 2 drops. And that may be related to avian flu. Next bird, another chickadee, and this is one of those first birds that probably is really heavily influenced by people counting birds or watching feeders in the northern and the eastern part of the state over by the Tetons, toward Yellowstone. Mountain chickadee, very similar to the blackcap, except that little line over the eye. And their vocals are very distinctive. They sing a chickadee, but it's really wheezy and kind of weak. So it's a kind of a funny little chickadee call that you can usually pick out right away once you're familiar at all with them. Unfortunately, another bird that looks like it's going down, although a big rebound last winter from the previous, 1, 2, 3. And a lot of variation. Look at that, 13 units of variation over time. So these guys are really bouncing around, and I wouldn't, it's another one I wouldn't worry too much about until I see some more years of data or look at some other sources. Looks like it's going down, but it might just be part of their big variation over time. So back to our native species. Here's number 14, mourning dove. We'll talk about the difference between mourning doves and collared doves in a second. Yet another native species. It looks like it's on a downward trend. Fair amount of variation over time, 8 units, but by far the lowest count last winter. So again, is this just an anomaly, one of those one-off situations, or will we see a continued decline into the future? And that's really what Project Feeder Watch does. It gives us this long-term data source. It's not completely standardized because you don't know exactly, I might count birds one year and then not the next. And so you get people coming and going. So there's a little bit of variation in there that we can't control. But nonetheless, it's a pretty good data source over the long term, especially at larger scales. Next, we have probably the most dimorphic, that is males and females being super different. Red-winged blackbird, male being the blackbird with the red wings and the female looking like a giant sparrow with a sharp beak. And these birds looks like they're about ballpark stable over time. A lot of variation, 9 units, but you can see the last 4 winters they've been at that same rank of number 15. Next, another little streaky bird, pine siskin. And really bad news for this bird, the way it looks, and this has been corroborated by other sources of evidence that their populations are really declining. And you can see a very steep decline here despite enormous variation over time. This bird varies more than any of the others, 16 units, all the way from what number? Second most common bird in the winter of 2012, 2013 on Idaho feeders, all the way down to number 18 the last 2 winters. So we're worried about siskins. A lot of these finches that live in the boreal forest or in montane forests, red crossbills, pine grosbeaks, Cassin's finches are really widespread, and there's some really big scale dynamics affecting them. Bug kills of millions of acres of forest, fires, seed cone production varies from year to year. So it's not unusual to see a lot of variation in these types of birds, but this trend is, like I said, it's shown up in the breeding season too. And I don't know if anybody has any idea what's going on with them. It's too bad. This is a great little bird. Next is this sparrow. I've only had, in 29 years, I've only had one winter, but somebody's got a lot of song sparrows on their feeders or in their yards while they're watching their feeders. And this is sort of the picture of stability, I think. You can see they varied by 6 units over time, but quite a little bit up and down, pretty flat. And of course, they're here all year round in the riparian areas along the Boise River and along any kind of creek or stream or pond that's got some willows or some dense cover. These guys are there all year round. Next, everybody, I think, loves to have these guys around if you have a chance, you have the habitat for them. California quail. And another bird with a little bit of good news, despite kind of a low point last winter, it looks like the long-term trend is slightly up. So quail are notoriously susceptible to springtime rain. So if right when the chicks come out of the nest, you get a wet period, cold weather really causes a lot of mortality. So the conventional wisdom with quail is if you can get through that hatching period without a lot of cold, wet weather, then they're probably going to do okay. They're also susceptible to being killed in the winter. And you will notice around here, you start, after a few mild winters, you start seeing, or at least hearing more, like out in the foothills, especially in the Hawaiis. And then if you get a couple of cold winters, it knocks them out and pushes them back. And it takes them some years to recover. So they're pretty susceptible to weather. Next bird is our first bird who eats birds. We got 2 of those on this top 25 list. So these guys don't care about your sunflower seeds or your suet, but they sure like all the birds that are eating the seeds and the suet. Sharp-shinned hawk. We'll talk about how to tell a sharp-shinned or a sharpie, as we call them, from a Cooper's hawk, also a coop. So if I say sharpie and coop, that's what I'm talking about. And it looks like they may be on a slight downward trend as well. They bounce back last winter up to, where are we at, number 19 from a low of number 21. But again, all in all, it looks like they may be downtrending for some reason. I have no idea what's going on there. Next, this little guy, another goldfinch, lesser goldfinch. And this is the first bird now. You can see that up until the winter of 2015, 2016, it was not even in the top 25. That's why there's no dots over there. It was down there somewhere, but it was not in the top 25. And then they kind of burst on the scene in the winter of 2015, 16, and then jumped way up 2 years ago. They've fallen back a little bit last year, but based on my experience with these birds, they are definitely increasing. They've used to be quite rare. If you had a look, when I moved here in '92, if there was a lesser goldfinch, usually down in the Boise River somewhere, people would actually, you know, drop their whatever they were doing and go look at it. And now they're, I don't know about your area, they're certainly everywhere in my neighborhood, and they outnumber American goldfinches by a lot on any given day. So that's good news. Great bird, really beautiful songs and calls, and they're a mimic, so they're a lot of fun to have around. All right, so here's our second bird eater, Cooper's hawk, number 21 last winter. And here's another bird that was not in the top 25 for many years through this stream, and they've just kind of come on the scene. And you can see in the last, 5 winters, they're in the top 25. This bird is pretty well known to be succeeding and spreading in urban areas. It's quite obvious to me where I live that there weren't any, and now they're, like, any given day I might see one in my neighborhood. And this has been documented by more than anecdotal observations like I just gave you. Data show that these guys are really being successful. And not only here, but places like Florida, they're just taken over, not taken over, but they're thriving in suburban neighborhoods where they're probably eating a lot of birds that we're bringing into the feeders. Next bird we will not get in the top 25 if it's based on feeders around southwestern Idaho. Again, more montane locations. We'll have number 22, Steller's jay. And this is actually, the last winter was the first time they were ever in the top 25. So once more you ask, is this just a fluke? Are they going to drop out again, or are they increasing and they're here to stay? I wish they'd come around my yard. I think they're fabulous birds, and I hope it is an increasing trend. The next bird, spotted towhee, number 23, also the first time in the top 25 last winter. So if we get more towhees to go along with more Steller's jays, that would make up maybe for losing a few of these other birds or having them be less common. Fabulous bird, love these guys. Next, a bird that we do have routinely and probably everybody knows, the white-crowned sparrow. And of course, the adults have the bright white and black stripes, and the subadults of both sexes have the brown and sort of grayish stripes. So it's a matter of age. They're not different species, they're different sexes. And here's another bird that sort of pops in and out of the top 25, kind of dropped out for a while and then came on the scene, and then 2 years ago kind of dropped back right to the bottom. So it's very, I wouldn't say anything about any kind of trend with a bird like this. You just don't know. You got to look at other sources of data to see if they're maybe increasing or if they're cyclical. They go up, they go down, they go up, they go down. We don't know from these data. Finally, number 25, we're at the 25th, hairy woodpecker. These guys, are sort of the montane equivalent of our downies. They're usually quite nicely separated by elevation. We get hairies here in the valley, get downy woodpeckers here in the valley, and then as soon as you start heading up to Bogus Basin or up to McCall or up to Silver City, and then you get out of downies and start getting into hairies. Unfortunately, it looks like they also have a bit of a decreasing trend. You can see this is the second time they've been at number 25. I don't know. That looks a little troublesome to me, and I haven't heard anything about downy wood or hairy woodpeckers. I don't know if there's a known issue with them or not. Yet more homework to do for you and me. So don't expect you to digest this, but I just wanted to put it up, kind of a summary of, I don't have all 25 here, I think 23, just so I didn't squish the font down too small. But it just shows you that we've got quite a variation here. We've got species with not too much variation from year to year, 5, 6, 5 units, 6 units, 1 unit, 4 units. We got some with very high variation. The pine siskins bounce around a lot, mountain chickadees, robins, nuthatches, red-breasted nuthatches are varying quite a bit. And we've got a number of species going down and a few species going up. So this is kind of what you get with bird world. It's not usually anything very clean or very precise. You just got a lot of different things going on. All these birds are different. Their populations are different. Their food habits and their behaviors are different. And I think they respond somewhat independently of each other in a lot of cases. So just for fun, let's look at a few more species that have been in the top 25, but weren't last year. Remember, that was just last year I was looking at as far as the ranking system. Cedar waxwing's been in the top 25. Varied thrush. American crow. Brown creeper. Go to McCall if you want to see these guys. Evening grosbeak. And evening grosbeaks have been declining at a pretty steep pitch. When Partners in Flight did its conservation vulnerability assessment, I think in 2016, this one came out. We put the evening grosbeak on the cover because it's widespread, shared by Canada and the US, and with known steep declines. So this is a bird. It's tough to study these guys, you know, and I don't know if anybody really has any ideas about, I mean, there are ideas about why they're declining. I don't know if anybody has any really solid evidence of a cause. Of course, that's what we want to try to get to, especially for a bird that is so magnificent. Another bird that's been in the top 25, Cassin's finch. We'll talk about how to tell them from house finches in a minute. This is another bird that's on the watch list of this same report. Another bird that's shown widespread declines. And since both evening grosbeaks and Cassin's finches are montane forest birds, then you start looking, okay, is there something in common about the food supply, or I don't know what that might be driving them both. Maybe not, but maybe. Another bird that will not get in the top 25 based on southwestern Idaho is a common redpoll, really a northern species. Interestingly, American kestrel has been in the top 25. And a bird I mentioned a second ago, red crossbill, also has been in the top 25 birds in Idaho. So when you go to Project Feeder Watch, you can not only look at a particular state, but you can look at trends by region. And their regions are quite large, as you can see on this map. So I thought it would be fun to, let's see what some birds are that are in the top 25 in the Northwest, but were not in our top 25 in Idaho last. So this is just last winter. What happened last winter? Most of us don't think about hummingbirds in our winter feeder picture, but if you live on the coast, Anna's hummingbird is the 11th most common bird on feeders, and obviously they're not eating sunflower seeds. People leave their hummingbird feeders up for these guys, but that's a lot of hummingbirds in winter. And it shows you what, if you didn't know already, what a different world that northwestern coast is from BC down into Northern California. Whoops. Our third chickadee, so number 12 last year in the Northwest chestnut-back chickadee, another bird that's very common over in those Cascade forests, but we don't get over here too much. We have these guys, but they are not very common. I wish there were more. Wished it was number 16. This sparrow you might not even notice in winter plumage, but if you saw the male in breeding plumage, you'd figure it out pretty fast. Golden crowned sparrow, we get maybe one a year in these parts, but they're obviously a regular bird all across the Northwest coast. Number 24 last year, Bewick's wren. And another bird I wish we had more of, fox sparrow. Fabulous big sparrow, beautiful song. And we have them in high elevation streams in the summertime breeding, but they don't seem to come around feeders much or come into our yards much in the winter. So a few comparisons of some similar species. Cassin's finch and house finch are superficially pretty similar, but there are a lot of field marks on these two birds that tell them apart. My number one field mark on Cassin's finch is this big, broad, whitish or pale eye line that's just not on house finches. You can see that in birds of all other sorts of plumage, degrees of red, and so on. House finches are pretty heavily streaked. House finches have this curved upper beak, which is quite unusual among birds. You compare the Cassin's finch, that's more typical for this group of birds anyway, to have a very straight, pointed beak. The house finch looks like a little parrot beak almost. And another field mark that's surprisingly good, you can see from a great distance, they always seem to have a little bit of a crest or have those feathers erected on the top of the head as opposed to a smooth round head. That's really good even at quite a distance. Our two doves, the introduced collared dove and our local mourning dove, of course, if you can see the collar, you got it made. Sometimes when they're hunched down or they're facing you, you can't see the collar. They have a big square tail instead of a pointed tail. And whoops, before we leave them, back up, sorry. They're quite a bit bigger and they're much whiter. I've noticed when they're sitting up in the sun, these collared doves almost look like a white pigeon as compared to mourning dove, which tends to have and even have kind of a warmish fawn tone. Okay, sharp-shinned hawk and Cooper's hawk. This little cartoon shows you some of the differences. The sharp-shinned hawk has a rounded head with a hood. That black goes across the top of the head and down the nape of the neck, whereas on the Cooper's hawk, they have a cap and then a break, and you'll see that gray on the back of the neck. It's quite good field mark in almost any kind of lighting or all sorts of angles. The sharp-shinned hawk has a square tail and the Cooper's hawk a rounded tail, and this is a great field mark if you're angled right and if they have their tail feathers together. A lot of times I've noticed they sit with their tail feathers splayed out a little bit, and then you cannot tell if that's square or round. I've got a photograph that shows that quite well, I think. The eyes of the sharp-shinned hawk are more centered in the middle of the head, so it gives it a so-called surprised look. And the Cooper's hawk, the eye is more forward and gives it an angry look. And when I first saw this cartoon, I thought, yeah, whatever. I actually think this works great. If you can see the face, I think the surprised and the angry really works well. Check it out. And again, that gray nape is what shows, I think gray or dark nape is a terrific field mark in almost any kind of situation. And these two photos are really good for that. You can see on the right, check out the Cooper's hawk, got the flat head, the rounded tail, which shows really well, very clearly rounded tail. But look at that sharp-shinned hawk. He's got his tail splayed out a little bit, and you can't tell if that's square or rounded the way he's sitting. You can see the gray on the back of the neck of the Sharpie and the Coop and the gray on the Sharpie. And once again, that shows up pretty well. I think the surprised and angry works well on these two birds as well. All right, all my arrows. I forgot I had those in there, sorry. So downy and hairy woodpeckers in the winter, when the hairies come down out of the mountains, you can get both around here. The nice thing about these birds is they sort of carry their best field mark with them, and it doesn't matter about the lighting or the distance or anything else. The downy woodpecker has a very small beak compared to the depth of its head, and the hairy woodpecker has a beak that's just about as deep as its head is. And I think this field mark's terrific. You can pick it off even at a great distance. That hairy will seem to have a rather large beak, and the downy quite a small beak. So anytime you get those sort of relative proportions, it's a great field mark because it doesn't depend on judging the size of the bird or anything else about the bird. All you have to do is look at the proportions. Pine siskins and American goldfinches are often found together because they love thistle seeds, so they'll both be on your thistle feeder at the same time. They're in the same genus, so they're very closely related. The siskins are heavily streaked, and the American goldfinches are plain. Whoops. And you will also note when you start looking at these birds that the siskins are smaller. Now, that's not something you probably will pick up on right away, but over time, you'll see that they're a smaller bird. I deliberately picked two American and lesser goldfinch pictures that make them look as similar as possible. A lot of the birds are easier to tell than these two, but you do get these birds right here, and it's like, holy cow, it's the same bird. Lesser goldfinches are a lot smaller, but that's another thing you pick up only after you watch for a while. You'll see how small they are. A really good field mark that works, if you can see the undertail coverts, in the lesser goldfinch are yellow, and in the American goldfinch are white. And this, to me, is shown to be very reliable. And the other thing is this little, it's almost a little square of white in the wing of the lesser goldfinch. They both have wing bars, and they can, they got white going on in the wings. But this little chink here, almost like a little kinglet mark, is pretty reliable, and I like that as a field mark as well. The vocals are very good, but that's another subject. Smaller. So pine siskin house finches, I get questions on these birds because they're both streaky brown birds on the feeders. The siskin's quite a bit smaller, but again, I point you to the beak. The siskin beak is a sharp pointed little beak, and that house finch has that curved upper mandible that makes it look, as I said before, a little bit like a kind of parrot-like almost. The siskins have various amounts of yellow in the wings, whereas the house finches aren't going to have any of that. And so don't worry about the streaks. They're both streaked. Look at the beak, look at the wings. Two more little brown birds that superficially might seem kind of similar. The size is about the same, and they both have a lot of streaking. But just check out the head. The house finch has kind of a uniformly streaked head, finely streaked, doesn't really show too much pattern. And the song sparrow has really robust, broad brown and gray stripes that really make it pretty distinctive. So we'll finish up with just a few remarks on feeders and seeds. There are unlimited numbers of feeders out there, and if you get on the web and look around, you'll find yet more. It seems like every store has got bird feeders for sale. I happen to like these tube feeders because they're very easy to clean periodically, and you should clean your feeders to reduce problems with disease. They come apart, and you can rinse them out with a bottle brush and get them cleaned up really fast. They're also really easy to squirrel proof, and I'll talk about that in a second. I also like these fly-through or platform feeders because if you have something like that, you can get maybe several species at a time next to each other, which is kind of fun for photo ops or just fun to watch. That middle bottom one is a thistle feeder, and thistle feeders are especially designed for the tiny thistle seeds. You can't put thistle seeds in these other types like that tube feeder. They just will just pour out of there. You need really tiny openings. And I have, in fact, had this exact feeder for probably 25 years before it kind of got wrecked by getting blown out of the tree. And finally, suet feeders. Woodpeckers and nuthatches, chickadees really like suet. So if you want to increase your odds of getting these birds in the yard, be sure you have get a feeder. It's just a little square cage, and you can buy the suet blocks for about $1 each. And squirrels also will get on there and tear it up, so you might have to squirrel-proof your suet feeder unless you want to feed the squirrels. So speaking of squirrels, my favorite squirrel picture. I've got these guys, and I wish I didn't, honestly. They're cute, but so I use these squirrel baffles on my feeders, and the ones I use, I have these types on my poles, and they are 100% effective. Squirrels cannot get around them if you put them up high enough. If you put them too low, they'll just jump over them. If you get them at the right height, they cannot get around that baffle going up. In the lower corner, I have that exact baffle on my hanging feeder, my one hanging feeder. That's not on a pole, it's in a tree. And that also is 100% effective. They will try endlessly to get around that, and they usually come down from the tree, grab onto that little that little bolt with their rear legs and then try to reach out with their front legs and their body to stretch out around that baffle. But when they do that, the baffle tips, and if they let go, they just fall on the ground. So these are 100% effective in my experience. I haven't tried these other two, the plastic one and the other metal one, but I'm guessing they work perfectly fine. So lots of types of seed out there. Seed mixes are very popular, but some of the things you can see in that mix up on top, the corn, milo, the striped sunflower seeds, these are not the best things for birds. A lot of birds don't even touch that stuff. And the other corner is the thistle seed, which is absolutely recommended. You got to have a thistle feeder. Then you get your siskins and your goldfinches, and even juncos are able to deal with these seeds. So they just pile on to the thistle feeders. If you have quail, you're probably familiar with quail blocks already. If you want magpies, get some peanuts. Skip the cracked corn. In most cases, nothing eats that stuff. Millet and milo are very popular in the mixed seed mixes. Millet is liked by some birds. I find in my yard, mostly house sparrows want millet, so I rather not have too much millet out there. And the milo, for the birds I've got, is a total waste. Nothing eats it, and it just gets kicked on the ground. So I would avoid mixes with milo unless you want to feed like wild pigs or something. The gold standard for bird seed is black sunflower seed. That everything seems to love black sunflower seed, and you can buy it obviously in the shell or shelled. The birds, when they go through the shells, they just drop the shells all over your yard. And what I do is just take my leaf rake a couple times a winter and just rake those shells out so they aren't a foot deep. You can also buy shelled sunflower seeds. And I've been assured by Wild Birds Unlimited that the price per seed, usable seed, is about the same. So it's a lot more expensive to buy unshelled or to buy shelled seeds, but you don't have any waste. There's a really nice guide, again, going back to Project Feeder Watch. If you look around there at food and feeder preferences of common feeder birds, this is for North America. So when you go there, it asks you to pick your what region you're in, what food type you're curious about, and what feeder type you're curious about. And when you make a selection, then it will show you all the birds that will use that type of feeder in that particular area with that food type. So this is pretty cool right here. And I went and picked, so here's region, food type, and feeder type. So I went and picked the Northwest. I picked cracked corn to see if I could, maybe there's some birds eating cracked corn that I don't think are eating cracked corn. I said, don't buy it. Tube feeder, and you can see what four birds are pulled up. A blue jay, which I don't really think of as a Northwestern bird. There are a few around for sure. California scrub jay, not so much around here. And then starlings and house sparrows. So, you know, like I said, skip the cracked corn unless you want to feed these exotic species. Lastly, if you have the sort of the patience and the desire to maintain water, birds love water. They bathe even in the winter and drink. Even when they don't really need it, they will make use of it. So having a bird bath out there, don't forget to put a heater in it, or it'll crack your porcelain bowl pretty quickly. You're going to get some more birds for sure. You have to clean that water. It gets messed up pretty fast from seeds and bird droppings. And you don't want to get too much muck growing in there, so go out and clean that every so often. So that's a quick trip through last year's top 25 birds. I encourage you to go to the Feeder Watch site and look around. There's a lot to learn there, a lot of information. It's fun to, you can go back farther in time than what I did today. There's some data from when they started, maybe another decade before that. And again, if you have any comments or feedback or objections or complaints, you can send them to this Gmail address, and I would be happy to get any feedback from you. In the meantime, get your feeders up, buy feeders for your friends. They make great Christmas presents. If your friends have a yard and they haven't thought about birds, get them going. It don't cost too much money, and it provides a lot of entertainment for years into the future. So thanks again for joining me today, and we'll see you in November.